Hello, Green Spring. Today is Wednesday, January 4th, 2017. Gosh, I've been saying those last two numbers a long time. I'm Fran Duval, your host for today, and I'm here with Len Kalkworth, our resident. If nothing else, Len is the visitor to Presidential Libraries, and we're welcoming you today, Len.
Thank
Hello, and glad to have you for yet another of our quarterly meetings.
And today we deal with a wonderful president to talk about him. And if people don't feel that he was a great president, I hope that by the end of this half hour they will think so. Unfortunately, so many people probably think of him regarding Vietnam, and that was one of his major problems.
Well, that was the end. I mean, that's what caused his end.
But many people still think of him in terms of Vietnam. But there was a great legislation that he passed, many different legislation. I want to talk just a little bit about him before we show a number of pictures. The pictures deal with the Presidential Library, which is located, by the way, in Austin, Texas. And Bev and I were there twice to visit the library.
Bev is his wife, in case anybody's new.
Okay. I have to say this about LBJ. We'll refer to him as LBJ all the time. But he was a very crude man in many ways. Some of us remember he had no problem doing things that most of us would not have done. One time there was a picture in the newspaper of him showing one of his scars after his, and that was minor in terms of the things he did, but he was very crude in many ways. He also had very questionable ethics, at least in my estimation, and his morality was questionable as well. But I don't think we can question the results that he did. He had a number of mistresses over the years, well known, including, we're sure that his wife, Lady Bird, also knew that. So I want to mention that some of the presidential historians now feel that Lyndon Johnson really is in the second tier of great presidents. The first tier being Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. And then the second tier would be Thomas Jefferson, Jackson, and Teddy Roosevelt, and LBJ. So that would be where many of them are now classifying him. He was a very complex man. Many felt that he was very insecure. And I'd like to show you a picture of him in terms of how tall he was. This is a statue outside of his presidential library. I'm standing next to him. I'm a little over 6 foot tall, so you can see how tall he was. And many said that oftentimes what he would do is he would just bear down on a person, close to his face, looking down on the person. And people just could not say no to him because of his great stature and so on. Okay, we're going to do a little touring here.
I'm a little worried about your microphone. It slipped down again.
All right.
Yeah.
The first picture we're going to show is a picture of his boyhood home, which is in Johnson City, which is outside of Austin, Texas. And then the next pictures are the Presidential Library. And some refer to this as the pyramid. I think first of all, this is the only skyscraper type of libraries that we have. Has very few windows. I think it's ugly on the outside, but it is fantastic inside in terms of the things you see. We'll have another picture there. Here are the pictures. There's two walls of this. These are all past presidents. The top row would be the president, and below the president would be the First Lady.
Oh, okay.
And it's wonderful. In fact, I've seen the Presidential Library pictures over at the Portrait Gallery here in D.C., and I think this is, in many ways, greater because of the First Lady being with them also. Now, this is the other building. This is part of the Presidential Library, but this is the School of Public Affairs, LBJ School of Public Affairs, located right next to his library building. Understand that it's a very good school, has high ratings. Located here on the campus of the University of Austin. I think there's 30 acres that it encompasses. Let's go on to the next picture. Here is LBJ, and as a younger man, he's rather thin. But it's interesting that he did not do very well in school. In fact, he had difficulty getting into college. Eventually, he got into a teacher's college and apparently got his certificate. He taught for a year. And the school that he was assigned to was made up primarily of Mexicans. And in many ways, it probably was very good for him because he got to see how the poor people really lived. Many of the students, when they came to school, did not have food to eat, and he made it possible for them, some of them, to get to have something to eat. And that was one of his concerns in his presidency as well. His father and his grandfather both were politicians. They had been in the Texas legislature. So in terms of background, he had a very good background that way. And there was some money involved here, especially his wife had money, and she was very refined. She was really the opposite of what LBJ was. She was, and
even in physical appearance, she was really
physical.
opposite.
Yeah. He was crude. She was very refined, and so on. He taught for a year. And then he was invited by the representative from his area, to become his secretary. And then he went to Washington. And that was really the beginning of his own political career. And he immediately found this was his niche. And immediately he started making lots of friends on Capitol Hill. That was the beginning of really developing his political career. I think it was after a year or two, however, I don't know whether he got fired or whether he quit, but anyway, he left that position. And then FDR appointed him to be the head of the Texas Youth Administration. And then, of course, you know what happened later on. He tried to run for the Senate and House rather, and he did not make it, first of all. And then later on, of course, he becomes the vice president under John F. Kennedy. He was never comfortable as being a vice president. However,
well, he had really run for president. I mean, against Kennedy.
Yes, and of course he didn't make it, and then he becomes vice president. While he was vice president, Kennedy gave him a number of different assignments. One was that he headed the space program. Then he also, I think Kennedy sent him out of the country quite often, I think maybe to get rid of him, but because there was not a very close relationship between the two, which we know. He also oversaw a nuclear test ban treaty, and he supported JFK's decision to send political advisors to Vietnam. This is early on in the career. All right, let's go on to another picture here, because I want to talk a little bit about his Lady Bird. Let's go on to the next one. All right, Lady Bird, it's interesting. Her real name was Claudia Alto Taylor, but the nurse said when she was born that she was pretty as a ladybird, whatever that meant. And that name stuck, and people just referred to her as Lady Bird. Okay. Now, in the Presidential Library, and let's go on to that next picture. Here she is sitting at her office, but I really want to show the next picture primarily. This was her desk in the Presidential Library in Austin. And her filing system is quite different. I think the next picture may show that, but her filing system was that she would lay all of the papers on the floor. And apparently those things that had been done, there it is. The floor was Mrs. Johnson's favorite file for separating completed work from letters still to be signed.
Well, she was close to the floor.
Well, closer than LBJ was, that's for sure. Okay. All right. Let's go on. She really helped LBJ. I have to mention that LBJ had a major, what do you call it, a civil rights bill passed. And the civil rights bill, many of in the Southerners were just seething about that because, and then when LBJ was going to run for president, there were those in the South who were so opposed to him because of that. But Lady Bird then went on a whistle tour through 8 southern states. In fact, she started here in Alexandria, Virginia. And she notified all of the governors that she was going to go through their state. And she said, I'm going to be in your state. Wouldn't you like to join me? Well, many of them did. Of course, it was good for them to be seen with the First Lady. Sure. There were a few governors who absolutely refused, but with her sweet way of talking and so on, and being a Southerner, she could talk to the Southerners. And at the end of the tour, when the election took place, 6 of the 8 states went for LBJ. Yeah. Of course, that was in 1964. And in 1964, he won by a landslide, because that was when he went against, what's his name? The very conservative.
Right now, I'm blanking on who it is.
Okay.
But we'll get to it.
We'll get to that, okay.
Who did you say?
Goldwater.
Goldwater,
Thank
yes.
you, yes. How could I
Our
forget?
cameramen camera women are right on the ball.
Yeah, well, that's helpful.
It is helpful.
Yeah, okay. Then the next picture I have is one of the programs that, okay, well, let's go on to another one, I'm sorry. The Vista, which was a volunteer service that...
yeah, I remember that program.
Yes, and this was modeled after FDR's CCC program, yeah. But it was primarily, I think, for urban young people.
I see.
Yeah. Okay. And the other thing that she was interested in was a beautification program. And you may recall how she was beautifying the highways and so on, and all the plants that were...
you just have to ride down George Washington Parkway, right there across the river. I mean, this side of the river.
Yeah, well, it was across the country, too.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Very, very true. All right. Then she was also very much involved with LBJ on certain other things, and the next picture will show that she is sitting there planning the Presidential Library in Austin. So she was very much of a help. Okay, the library, by the way, there's a 4-story glass enclosed area that you can see from the Great Room. And this is where all of the documents of LBJ are kept. In fact, there are 40 million documents, all in bound, and you can see that through the glass there. It's amazing.
Does anybody get to use them?
Sure.
I mean, like scholars, if they want to go in.
Sure, and it's open to the scholars.
I mean, it's a library after all.
Well, that's the whole idea of the Presidential Library, is that the papers are kept there, that scholars can go there and do the research and develop their books.
Have they put it all on digital yet?
No, not there, I'm sure, not that. So, okay, now let's turn to LBJ himself. We've been talking mostly about Lady Bird. His goals was, excuse me, to do away with poverty, and he was talking about his Great Society and his war on poverty. And as a result of the war on poverty, he did establish any number of programs, many educational programs. One was a Head Start program for the young, but it went all the way, not just for the younger children, but also to the college level as well. And as a matter of fact, he probably had more educational programs than any president ever had. I think he passed 60 educational bills. Okay, but his big thing, I think, was the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, it outlawed discrimination based on race, on color, religion, sex, and national origin. Well, that was the beginning. I think it was still a very weak bill in many ways, but nevertheless, that was the beginning. And then let's go on to the next one, is voting rights of 1965. Here's LBJ sitting at his desk. I think I remember seeing this in newspapers many times, a picture like that.
Yeah. In the Oval Office.
In the Oval Office. Then the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was probably the strongest one of all. It again was, it outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, and sex, and national origin. But it was fair housing in this case. All right. Then he signed the Civil Rights Bill, and I think we have a picture of that. I think that's when Martin Luther King is there. And I believe that LBJ started the practice of signing his name with any number of pens, and then he'd write probably wrote one letter of his name and then handed a pen to somebody, and so he loved to do that.
Oh yeah, people frame those.
Yes,
and,
he loved to do those things, yeah. Now the next one is the Education Bill, and this is a very interesting one. This is his schoolhouse where Lyndon learned to read. It's right on the edge of where his ranch is. It reminds me of my own one-room schoolhouse that I went to, although mine looked better than this one does.
You were in Iowa.
Yeah, but this looks pretty poor, but nevertheless, this is where he went. But the next picture is the interesting one, because while you may not be able to see it very clearly, this is years later when he is president, and he is signing the education bill. It is in front of the schoolhouse, and you'll see on the right side of the picture, Lyndon is sitting there with one of his former teachers, and some of those are his former classmates. And that's where he was very dramatic in this respect. Okay. Now, in addition to that, he signed the Medicare bill, which was the amendment to the Social Security. He appointed the first African American to the Supreme Court. He also started one of the, I think it was the housing office of the cabinet, and placed a African American in there as well. Now, and the other thing that he did, he also signed the immigration bill. Now, prior to this, it was a quota basis in which we got into the United States. Most of it was from Northern European countries.
Right.
And Asian and African nations probably were not even on the radar. But when he signed the bill, it opened that up to African and the Asian, and that has changed the whole immigration situation in America. Now, when LBJ was president, he lived in a time so different from what we have today. In fact, in the beginning, it was still the old morality. In 1964, when Nelson Rockefeller was running, people feel that he actually lost his, I think it was his primary election, because it became known that he had been divorced, remarried, had a baby, and it was at that particular point. And many feel that he lost the election because of that. Well, all of that changed during Lyndon's tenure. The sexual revolution took place. People were wanting gay rights.
The women were coming out.
That's right. That's right.
Let's not forget the ladies.
Yes, let's not. Well, all kinds of new rights were asserted, and old duties were forgotten or denied. For example, it was not at all unusual for people to say that they would not serve in the military. This was all part of that whole period of time. And Lyndon really suffered from that. In fact, and because of the war in Vietnam, many of us remember how every night we would see reports on television about the body bags coming back from Vietnam. And there were those who were chanting, and I have it here, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" And it must have really hurt LBJ to have that. And then, of course, at the same time when that was taking place, the race riots were taking place. The race riots in D.C. Some of us remember the race riots in Watts. It was also the time when the drugs became very much a part of society. What was the LSD, for example, came at that time as well. So that sexual revolution took place. Now, I have a series of pictures that we're going to show now. Part of one room down in his presidential library. And let's go on to the next one here. Okay, there's a whole series of pictures here, and you'll just have to read some of the titles. But this indicates what took place during LBJ's tenure.
There's Warner von Braun.
Yes. Now, and Rachel Carson. Remember her? She wrote the book Silent Spring.
I couldn't quite read the name from here.
Let's go on to the next one. Now, again, all of these different individuals. There's Schultz, the comic strip creator of Peanuts, for example. Okay. Now, you recognize that soup can?
Of course.
Yeah. These are the things that were taking place during LBJ's tenure.
I see.
Neil Simon, for example. Now, you can almost recapture some of the things that were taking place at that particular time just by looking.
Just by the photos and the captions.
And I was so thrilled to see that whole area there. Yeah. All right.
Now, Len, did you take these pictures, or did you get a pack of pictures?
No, I took all those pictures.
You took them all.
Yes.
You didn't get them online or anything.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just wondered.
Yeah. I have many more. too many to show.
Like usual, we have more than we can fill in a half hour. Yeah.
But not only did all of these things happen, but at this particular time, his poll numbers were going down so much, and he couldn't win. You know, when people were talking about these things, and he wanted to get himself out of Vietnam, but he couldn't do it. He had a peace plan that apparently looked very good and was a real possibility. And this was when he had already said that he wasn't going to run again, but Hubert Humphrey was now going to be running. And it was at that point that he heard that Nixon, who was going to be running, was doing something about destroying the possibility of that peace plan. And so he talked to Nixon, and Nixon said, no, I wouldn't do anything like that. Well, he lied. And by the way, it was interesting. Earlier this week, there were 2 articles in the New York Times that now have proven the fact that Nixon actually was involved and destroyed the possibility. And this is from the notes from Haldeman, who later became his chief of staff. And check the New York Times. I think it was a Monday or Tuesday's issue. So his poll numbers were down, as I say. At one point in 1963, he had a 75% approval rating. It went below 30 later on. He said there was nothing he could do that would satisfy people. In fact, he made the comment that if tomorrow I walk across the Potomac, the headlines in the newspaper the next day would say, "President can't swim." Terrible, poor guy. Okay, then I think many of us, we remember this when he made his speech in March. He said that he wasn't going to run again. So he retired, and he retired to his ranch. And we went to see Bev and I went to see his ranch, and I want to show some pictures of that. And the first one is the picture of a windmill. This is the beginning of his ranch. And the next one, I think, is a picture of his longhorn steers. Not necessarily a good picture, but it showed. And then we move on to his ranch itself, a big open area. And Bev and I drove all the way around the perimeter of the ranch. And I think it was 7 miles. Now, I also understand that it's not polite to ask a rancher how many acres he has.
Oh, really?
But LBJ loved to talk about how many acres he had. Now, I'm not sure how many acres he had, but the ranch that's been turned over to the national park is, I think, 1,500 acres.
Wow, that's pretty big, isn't it?
I know, that's big. That's about 2 miles, 2.5 square miles, maybe. In the middle of that ranch is an airstrip. And what LBJ would do, he would fly to Austin in regular Air Force One, and then because the plane was too large to land at his ranch, he would then get a smaller plane, which would be this one, which would then automatically became Air Force One.
Right.
And that is housed there as well. Then next to this is his house, and we'll go to that. In fact, well, first I've got to show you this one. I found this very interesting. This is converted. There's a gun rack in the back, and there's a wet bar. And I can almost picture him, and there's one of his cronies sitting in the back, driving around the ranch, shooting, drinking. And when I mentioned this to somebody, they said, well, it's probably he was driving, not sitting in the back. So, okay. Then we'll see, this is his house, a rather modest house.
Sure.
We went through it. Nothing fancy about it, but he spent at least 20% of his presidency here at the ranch, not in D.C. And I think a lot of people probably were not aware of that. He put a big addition to this house, and the next picture I think will show that. Yes, there's the
wow.
addition, yeah. And this was his office. And as we were in the office, I was impressed with it, the size of that room. In one corner or one end was his desk. And by the way, he had a new, latest technological machine there that was very new. And it was a fax machine. Okay. And that way he could be in touch with the White House continually. Then he had, I think it was 3 or 4 other desks for his secretaries as well. Outside of the house is a swimming pool, and he was noted for spending time with his grandchildren and so on. So, and then we'll move on to the last few pictures. The family cemetery is right at the edge of his ranch, and then this is where both he and Lady Bird are buried, and we'll see that there are the tombstones there. So there we are.
Wow, you went through that quick. The time is up. Isn't that awful?
Yes, we need another half hour.
I know.
There are so many things about LBJ that's so good, and I hope that people will do some research on it.
And what's the book you used as your source?
Well, I use a presidential series, and there is a book on each one of the presidents.
Okay.
Each book is probably about 100, 150 pages, and written by different authors, and some of them are very well-known authors as well. And then there are other books that I check as well, but that's the primary one that I use.
Well, you need to get started on the next president.
I already have.
Oh, you have.
Do you know who it is?
I guess it's Nixon.
Yes, it's Nixon.
And I don't need to guess. I know it's Nixon. But we'll come to the audience in April with that?
Yes.
Okay.
And I must say that now we'll be going to California, and the Nixon Library is a very, very interesting library and has an interesting history as well.
Okay,
but
good.
We'll talk about that next time.
That's a good teaser for people.
Good.
Thank you, Len, very much.
Yeah.